So who would make your short list of Loyalists to know during that time?
So I think that there are a lot of people who could make the short list, and part of the reason is that there's a very long list to choose from. And one thing that I want to make clear is that when we talk about loyalism, we're actually talking about a really high percentage of the population of the American colonies. We're talking about approximately 1 in 3 members of the population in 1775 who remain loyal to the king. So there's a lot of people to choose from. This is not a tiny little fringe group on the edges. But out of that group of about 1 in 3 Americans, I would want to pick a few people who seem to me to represent the range of loyalist positions. Loyalism was an idea, a set of ideas, a set of beliefs and practices and customs and culture that spanned the entire ethnic and geographic and religious spectrum of early America. So I would pick out probably 3 figures. One would be an example of a white loyalist with some ties to Britain and to Europe, the kind of person who you might, on the face of things, expect to be loyal. This is a woman whose name was Elizabeth Lichtenstein. She was born in Georgia in the 1760s. Her father was a servant of the colonial government in Georgia. He had a job with them. And so, as I say, these are people who had some kind of connection to the British government, some kind of connection to Europe. John Lichtenstein himself had been an immigrant into the colonies. And yet, by picking Elizabeth Lichtenstein as one of my shortlisted loyalists, one of the things I want to point out to people is that, you know, we're talking about women. We're talking about also someone who was really young at the time the war started. She was a teenager at most when the war began, sort of 12 years old. And she was really brought into the war through the affiliations of her parents, her father in particular. And yet she ended up growing up between 1775 and 1783. This covered the entirety of what would today be, let's say, middle school and high school for somebody. This is a girl who's basically caught on the front lines of this war. And she's a loyalist because, in part, her father has remained loyal and they feel like they have more to lose by joining the rebels. But she ends up paying the price that a lot of loyalists do in defeat. So Elizabeth Lichtenstein would be one of my shortlisted loyalists. Let me mention a couple of others who I think represent different faces of loyalism at this time. One of them would be the loyalist David George. David George was born into slavery. He was born into slavery in the American South in the 1740s, and he, like many African Americans held in slavery at the time of the American Revolution, didn't feel like he had a lot of reason to support his white masters who were rebelling against Britain. And when British governors and British generals came into the South and into the slave-owning communities of the South, and they offered to African Americans the possibility of becoming free if those slaves came to join British forces, that looked like a pretty good bet to David George. And he was one of tens of thousands of African American slaves, including slaves belonging to Thomas Jefferson, slaves belonging to George Washington, for whom the promises of freedom held out by the British were way more compelling than the ideas of liberty championed by their former owners.
And that was known as Dunmore's Proclamation.
Yes, so the initial offer of freedom given to black loyalists was issued very early in the conflict by the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. It's called Dunmore's Proclamation, and you can read it, and it's a very interesting document to take a look at. The recruitment of slaves into the British Army began right at the beginning of the war. The third loyalist that I would shortlist also represents another of these faces of loyalism, and that belongs to a fellow that we know by the name of Joseph Brant. Joseph Brant was a Mohawk Indian living in upstate New York on Mohawk land. His elder sister, Molly, had been for many, many years in a relationship with the Irish-born superintendent of Indian Affairs in upstate New York, a man called William Johnson. And Joseph Brant had thus been raised in a kind of extended family and a household in which there was a close alliance between the British and between the Mohawk Indians, who indeed had various kinds of treaties of alliance with the British. And so when the war started, for Joseph Brant, as for many Indians in the future United States, again, the choice seemed fairly clear what to do. The choice was either to stay with the people with whom they had long been allied, the British, or to join the people who they knew best as settlers who really wanted to take their land. And so, again, for Indians, the Mohawks in the north, the Creek in the south, the choice to remain with the British seemed pretty self-evident.
I think that really changes the perspective for a lot of people of that it wasn't just whites that were going back to England, but there were a large diversity among the Loyalists.